right, so for our movement literacy or our movement education piece, what we're trying to do with this is just give you some of the contextual cues and some of the instruction or insight from the coaching perspective that with remote setup or remote programming sometimes gets lost in translation. So with that, the first thing that we'll cover here today is our primary stances that we'll work from. And the first one being a bilateral stance. This is obviously the most common, but with this, what we're going to look for is foot placement somewhere between shoulder width and hip width, depending on your leg length, depending on what your training history consists of. Play around with that. For some people, a wider stance gives their pelvis a better opportunity to move. For others, they need a little bit more of a narrow stance. So you adjust that to how it makes sense to you, how it feels to you. The second thing that we'll look at from there is the angle of rotation of the feet. So for most people, you want to start neutral and then usually like some degree of external rotation. But again, that's one that's going to be a little bit individualistic in itself. So from bilateral, we go into a split stance, and with the split stance, I like to think about having 60% of my weight in my front foot, 40% of my weight in my back foot, and as we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, the foot cueing on this is I like to think about melting the front foot or trying to kind of compress or spread my foot into the ground, while on the back foot we're thinking stab, driving predominantly through the ball with a big toe. From here, the one thing to be mindful of on the split stance, especially when it's a squat variation, is the knee tracking. So for this, we want to optimally have the knee stay in line with the hip as we descend through our squat. What will commonly happen is people will have this situation here where the knee kind of kicks out away from the body. We want to try to track straight under the hip. From a split stance, we go into a kickstand, which is essentially just a half split. So for a kickstand setup, I like to line up the ball of the big toe of my back foot to the heel of my front foot. And with this, we're going to have closer to 80-20% weight distribution front to back here. But you notice I'm still melting in the front side, still stabbing on the back side. The kickstand is going to predominantly be used for deadlifts. We won't really program that much elsewhere, but for that, again, we want to make sure that that back heel is staying elevated as we go throughout the course of our movement. And then lastly, we have single leg positioning. So for single leg, most important with the single leg position is the positioning or pressure of the foot and then the positioning of the hip. So for the foot, we're thinking melting, spreading the toes, compressing into the ground, and then keeping a soft knee on our stance leg so that we can stabilize predominantly through the glute. What a lot of people will want to do is they'll want to bang their knee out, lock their quad, and stabilize in that manner. What we want to see is that soft knee flex through the glute, stabilize through the pelvis.